everyone. I'm Iris, as you know. Today I'll be talking about reinventing post-natural disaster shelter provision, particularly evaluating the potential of existing accommodation as alternative shelter in urban emergency response. So what does that mean? I want to start off by giving you a scenario. So let's just imagine this is you, or if you're a man, this one is you. You currently live in a city, in a home with your sibling. But suddenly there's a storm that comes to your city. This storm is very, very big, and you've never experienced a storm like this before. Because of this storm, your house starts flooding. And because of this storm, the flood remains in your neighborhood, and as a result, your house starts getting damaged, and eventually your house becomes so destroyed to the level that you are no longer able to comfortably inhabit this home anymore. So what does this mean for you and your sibling? You are now officially called an internally displaced person, abbreviated as IDP. An IDP is defined as a person or a group of people who are forced to flee their home that they are living in due to, for this instance, natural disasters, but it can be other things like human conflict or violence. The Internally Displaced Monitoring Center estimates approximately 20 million people per year getting displaced due to natural disasters. This is about 1/3 of the population of the UK. You and your sibling are now labeled an intra-urban IDP, which is within the group of IDPs. It's a group of people who are forced to fled within an urban area. So my research topic focuses on these intra-urban IDPs. So let's go back to our scenario. Your home has been destroyed, and you and your siblings are now IDPs. You have several options for emergency shelter. One is no shelter at all. You just end up on the streets. Number two is you enter a collective accommodation. These are things like evacuation centers, school gyms, libraries, stadiums, places where a large amount of people can go and live just for the purpose of having a shelter. Your other option is hosted arrangements. These are things like host families, hotel private rooms, hostel shared rooms, and things like that somebody is providing an extra room for you. Another option is vacant lots. Vacant lots are typically furnished or unfurnished empty homes whereby nobody is living currently in the moment. These can be owned by the government or private owners. Another one is called unplanned settlements. These are basically informal sites or parks where people who are similar to you, who have been displaced, go and collect into an area, and if a humanitarian aid group or your government have provided tents and tarps, you will have that as your temporary shelter. The last alternative is that you don't evacuate at all. Maybe you believe that your house is not as destroyed as it looks. Maybe you think that you can still live in it. All of your valuables are still in there, so therefore you want to stay there. So these are all the options you have. So when you look at these 6 options, what do you think are the best ones? It's quite obvious. The first priority typically looks like hosted arrangements or vacant lots, because these are the arrangements and the shelters whereby you can live almost like a daily life. The unfortunate truth is right now there are no supplies of hosted arrangements and vacant lots. In addition to this, a lot of the humanitarian aid organizations, governments, and the UN, they are not doing any research to investigate whether or not we can increase the supply of these hosted arrangements and vacant lots. So the reality is that most intra-urban IDPs end up in collective accommodation. We're not saying that this is bad, because collective accommodation does have a lot of benefits. Things like the humanitarian aid groups and local governments, if there's a food security problem, you know that you can send all of the food there. You can register the number of people there, so you know how many people are exactly displaced. So there are benefits, but the quality of living is just not that good. In addition, a lot of people just don't end up not evacuating. They don't understand that the situation that they're currently in is actually bad. But for this research, we're not going to look into the impact of not evacuating, just because it's really difficult to standardize. So what can we do? I just mentioned earlier that the hosted arrangements and vacant lots are very obviously the best solution, but nobody's looking into it. So what if we can create a system, potentially a digitized system, to supply more of these vacant lots and hosted arrangements to these IDPs, particularly in urban environments? We can see that there are direct benefits, indirect benefits, and induced benefits. And within the direct benefits, we talk about the impact of somebody who is displaced moving from a collective accommodation, which is like evacuation centers, to either a vacant lot or a hosted arrangement. So we looked at 3 different scenarios based on 5 different qualities of a shelter that is identified by the SPHERE standards. This includes family, livelihood, and dignity, wash, protection from the weather, security, and environmental sustainability. And these were all done based on a multi-criteria decision analysis. So the first scenario is assuming that you and your siblings have priority in your physiological and safety needs. So these are things like your actual protection for from the weather, food, just the basic survival needs. If that is your priority, then moving from a collective accommodation to a vacant lot will allow a 55% increase in your shelter quality. Same thing for hosted arrangements, it becomes 66% increase in shelter quality. If you don't know, if you believe that all of these factors are important, then moving from a collective accommodation to a hosted arrangement will allow for a 70% increase and a 74% increase for vacant lots. If you think, no, actually, I don't really care about whether or not I have food, I don't actually care about my sanitation, all I really care about is that my loved ones' well-being, dignity, security, and livelihood is good. We have actually seen this in previous case studies where in a disaster situation, actually families do prioritize this often. So when you move from a collective accommodation to a hosted arrangement in this situation, your quality of shelter increases by 72% and 88% for vacant lots. So there's a lot of numbers there, but basically the bottom line is that there is a significant improvement in shelter quality if we can improve and increase the supply of these types of shelters. There are also indirect benefits. So unfortunately, it's probably not possible that hosted arrangements and collective and vacant lots are going to be available for every single person who gets displaced. But actually there are also improvements in the people who are also staying in the collective accommodation. So for every family that remains inside the collective accommodation, they can realize improvements because of the less crowdedness of the collective accommodation due to people moving from these collective accommodations to the hosted arrangements or vacant lots. So they can realize improvements in sleep, reduce noise pollution, reduce risk to disease control, diseases, and etc. We can also see induced benefits, and by induced benefits, I'm talking about people who may not particularly be the ones who are displaced, but maybe the people who are in the area who are not displaced, the economy, the government, the people who are involved in disaster response in general. So I have 3 scenarios here for you as well. This is not an exhaustive list, but I think that these are probably the ones that are the most compelling. So number 1 is redirecting volunteers. So what typically happens when a natural disaster comes is that the people who are associated with that area or that nation feel like they want to help. So typically right now what happens is that people help through monetary donations, but people also want to volunteer at the spot. And a lot of times people want to go because they want to help the people, but unfortunately in current situations, a lot of the volunteers actually cause a lot more harm than they do benefits. The primary reason for this is because they are not there for that long. They require resources, they require food, they require accommodation, and they don't actually know what they're doing because they're not professionals in disaster response. But these people have an urgency or they feel a need to want to help because they have this like burning feeling inside them. I definitely felt that in 2011 and I am a culprit to this because I did go and volunteer for 1 week and I didn't really do anything, probably. So how can we solve this? We can reduce the number of people who are volunteering if we can provide hosted arrangements in those spaces. So these people who want to volunteer, who want to help, they can provide their empty rooms to people, or even if it's not empty, they can just provide their home to some people. And by then, the people who are IDPs will also benefit, and the people who are hosting will also feel good about themselves. So there's a benefit there. Number 2 is financial and environmental sustainability. So right now, as I mentioned, a lot of people are looking into improving the design of new shelter, new emergency shelter by building. There's a lot of money that goes into this, a lot of money that goes into delivering tents, delivering tarps, delivering new temporary shelters, delivering new containers, but this is very costly. In addition to this, this is not very environmentally sustainable because these are emergency shelters that are being built by things like plastic or being built by burning down trees. So all in all, if we can provide more housing through hosted arrangements and vacant lots, we can reduce the amount of spending that we are having for these people, for these new built shelters, and therefore potentially move the money towards the people who are supporting and improve environmental sustainability. Lastly, data collection has very recently been a very important topic both for the UN but also for the Sendai Framework of Disaster Risk Reduction. One of the big issues right now, not just with natural disaster-related displacement, but also for humanitarian crisis-related displacement, we are having a really hard time counting the number of people who are being displaced, counting where they are, what they end up doing after the disaster or the conflict. So if we can provide some sort of digital platform where we can identify the number of hosts, the places of the vacant lots, and have these people who are interested in moving into these temporary shelters go through a digital system to identify that they are displaced and they are living there, then we can also do some sort of data collection, which will benefit not just the government, but also big humanitarian aid groups and non-governmental organizations. So those are the overarching benefits, but obviously there are limitations. Not everybody is going to be able to implement this, right? Because we're going to need certain traits where we're going to be able to implement this, and unfortunately these are not going to be successful in all major cities. So what are these certain traits? That was another section of my research, and I focused on large cities, major cities that have 500,000 or more inhabitants. Started off with a list of 616 cities. And basically, through research, I identified the certain traits that these cities will need in order to implement this idea. And the features are, one, they have to have high exposure to disasters, because if they don't have high exposure to disasters, the government probably won't support this. It's not very relevant. And by being highly exposed to disasters, the local community and the local people probably understand how important it is to feel safe, to have a home after a natural disaster. So the likelihood of people contributing and participating if they have high exposure to disasters is much higher. Number two is political and economic stability. Because at the end of the day, we're going to need a big endorsement, some big body for us to back us up with this idea. So we're going to need to have government that's not corrupt. We're going to need to have government who are willing to support, and we're going to need to have some sort of money, constant money, to be able to fund something like this. So we need somewhere that has political and economic stability, both as a nation, but also as a city. Lastly, but not the least important, is good mobility and infrastructure. Of course, all of this is not going to happen if we don't have any vacant lots or if we don't have any hosted arrangements. So we need to have a space in which the infrastructure there is available, but we also need to have some sort of mechanism to get that internal displaced person from that place that they have been affected to the area which they will be hosted or housed. There is a caveat here, though. We do not know the impact of the disaster and how it will impact public transportation or the roads and things like that. Depending on the natural disaster, these things might be able to be have to be considered. But for now, at least if they have a foundation, there is a possibility that you will be able to use it in a natural disaster situation. So filtering for all of these different traits, we end up with 31 very distinct cities. And we rank these 31 cities based off of the risk/vulnerability of them, of that particular city to being exposed to natural disasters. And how they calculated that basically they called it a global economic index, which basically takes into account the number of people who are affected in the city, the type of natural disaster that's being affected by the city, and the number of economic productive days, working productive days lost. So there's a lot of variables in there, But the results come out to look like this. So this is the top 31, or all of the 31 that are feasible. There are 12 countries in total that represent the 31 different cities. But I think it's quite obvious here when you see. But if you look at the top 5, 4 out of the top 5 cities that are the most high risk to natural disasters and therefore will benefit the most from this idea are in Japan, of which Tokyo here at the top houses 38 million people, and the global economic index, according to the source that I researched, Tokyo has twice the value of the second place, Osaka, by a big margin. So it's very, very obvious that perhaps a case study in Japan, particularly in Tokyo, would be a good example for me and maybe future researchers to identify whether or not this idea is feasible. So this is the research that I have done so far, and this is still not complete. In the future, what would be good to do is to understand that, let's say that, yes, somebody is convinced, somebody wants to endorse this idea, we need to think about the things that would have to be included as part of this potential digital platform. So there are a lot of issues around shelter provision currently that's non-related to hosted arrangements and vacant lots, but can be transferred to this situation. One of them is beneficiary selection. This means if a disaster happens, it's most probably going to be the case that the supply of these hosted arrangements and vacant lots is not going to be higher than the demand for it. So there's going to be an over-demand and an undersupply. So in this case, who is going to be able to get these quote-unquote better shelters compared to things like tents and tarps or collective accommodation? We need to take that into account. Number 2 is inventory control. So how are we going to make sure that these hotel private rooms, hostel private rooms, hostel shared rooms, hosted families, and empty rooms are going to be readily available at all times when a natural disaster happens? We're going to need to find some sort of real-time platform whereby we're going to know the current situation of the supply. Exploitation management. So there have been cases where because of the nature of the mental well-being of people who have been impacted, it can be likely that if they go from a displaced person to maybe entering somebody's host family or going to a place that's furnished and has a lot of good things, they might want to steal things, or they might want to, end up doing things that are exploiting of the people who are good intended and providing their home for them. So how are we going to manage that? Is it going to be managed within the digital platform? Is it going to be managed by another entity? These are things that we need to think about. The second to last thing is project funding. So I mentioned this a little bit, but how are we going to fund this? Who's going to be responsible for it, and who's going to maintain all of this digital platform? And how are we going to ensure that this money is going to continuously be available? Lastly, provision support. So I mentioned earlier that collective accommodation has a benefit in the sense that humanitarian aid groups can go from wherever they are posted to certain collective accommodation that has been labeled typically for cities' urban response operations, so they know where to go. They can bring a massive truck of food or massive truck of non-food items and deliver it to people at the same time. So there's a benefit there, and if we disperse the people, the displaced people, then this provision of resources and also information might become more difficult. So we're going to need to find a way to be able to deliver these if this is something that we need. But this is all going to be next steps, and all of these issues or consequences are going to be investigated in the cultural context of Japan, and particularly Tokyo. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Iris, for a wonderful presentation. And it might be a naive question, but do you think an existing digital platform such as Airbnb can be adopted for this cause?
Yeah, so I love that you asked that because I wanted to put that in my presentation, but I didn't have any space or time. But Airbnb is the only company that I actually have done my research on that actually does this. So they have this initiative called the Open Homes Initiative, which is basically where the Airbnb community asks the host community whether or not they want to opt into this idea of offering their home for free to three different kinds of people: people who need help for family who are in hospitals and they live far away, so they want a place to stay near the hospital, asylum seekers, refugees, and also disaster relief, so place in the situation when your home is destroyed and you cannot. So I tried to reach out to them, but they weren't so friendly, so I don't actually know, aside from the content that I could get online. But they do have a system in place, and I think the best and the smartest thing to do is probably start from there. Look at the cohort of information that is already available.
That was a really, really wonderful presentation, Iris. So thank you for that. I was wondering if your framework could be reapplied. It seems like with climate change and the climate change crisis we're in, the statistics or the assessments might change over time.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be easy to deploy it repeatedly over a period of years?
Can you repeat the question again? So climate.
Sure. So it seems like with our current climate crisis,
Yep.
Which cities are vulnerable to natural disasters?
Yep.
Seems like that could very much change and get worse for certain areas versus others. So do you think that your framework could be reapplied on a continual basis to kind of reassess if there are new opportunities?
Yeah, definitely. But I'll also the vulnerability index that I'm using is doing iterative forecasting. So it gives out a vulnerability index for natural disasters every year. Yeah. So this one was based on 2018. Sorry.
Thank you for presentation, Iris. After World War II, many European governments forced families to host displaced people. Do you think that could still be possible today? And if no, why so?
In Europe?
Or generally?
Generally, I think maybe, I don't quite know that much about that situation, but it sounds like after World War II, which was a very obviously hard for everybody, the sentiment is there to want to help people, to want to get from a place that was not very good to some place that is better. The unfortunate thing and the difficult thing about natural disasters is that you can't have that feeling of wanting to help until it actually happens. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest issues with this, is that how do we get people to buy in before the incident ever happens? And then once it happens, what if these host families or what if these people are like, oh, actually, never mind, this is not my thing. I thought that I wanted to help, but then when the real thing came, they're a lot more of a pain. So to be honest, I don't know, and there hasn't been enough cases in the past that this has succeeded. But if you look at Japan, for example, after the 2011 earthquake, there was 75% of the nation donated at least $100, which is incredible. And also, a lot of people in that area just opened their doors and unlocked it and said, anybody walk in. You can sleep here if you want, you can charge your phone if you want, or you can use the toilet if you want. So there is a sentiment there, but it may only be for certain cities that are used to having these natural disasters come and come again because everybody has experienced it. So I don't know, that was a long answer to I don't know, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Iris. I guess my question is to do with when these kind of disasters happen. I don't know how it is in Japan. Maybe you can speak on that context. But for example, in New Orleans or Grenfell Tower in London, it tends to really impact lower income people more so than the higher you go up the income chain, the less likely you are to suffer major impacts out of this. And I guess, does that affect kind of how you've looked at this problem, or do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, so that would probably go into the whole beneficiary selection thing. So within the beneficiary selection, it's important to identify certain communities within the community. So these can be racial communities, these can be communities related on wealth. But let's just say, for example, somebody who is displaced comes from a poor background and they're hosted by a mega millionaire. We don't really know if that is the most feasible way to distribute shelter. So that probably has to be incorporated. An idea that could be used that my advisor mentioned was that currently, independent of the context of natural disasters, there are ways where you can identify the, I don't want to use the word handicap, but like the current state of your well-being. So, for example, right now they mentioned that in schools in the UK, certain people can be eligible for like meal passes if you come from a certain income level, and you can therefore get free food at the cafeteria rather than paying. And you can take advantage of all of these things maybe that are within that nation and kind of conglomerate them. But then you would also have to have some sort of database of information for each person for that, and people will need to log in that information before the disaster happens. A lot of this has to be vetted out, but that's a potential that can be investigated. But definitely within the beneficiary selection, something like income inequality would be taken into account.
Hey, well done. Great presentation. Just a question on your next steps. You mentioned exploitation management, the one direction kind of being like, the name I can't remember, could exploit the people that are hosting them. Have you considered the reverse, where it's like these people are really vulnerable in your next steps?
Yeah, definitely. So another thing, definitely thank you for mentioning that because I forgot to mention it. But there can be also instances where somebody initially wants to help and they welcome somebody into their community and then or into their home, and then that person ends up staying longer than they thought they were going to stay. For example, the host family might be like, oh, I can open my home for 2 days. But then, because of situations, they may end up staying for longer, a week, and then like the more and more longer they stay, the more they might feel like, well, why are you here for so long? Why are you taking all my food? Like at the end of the day, it's not like I have all the food in the world as well. And they might give kind of like negative vibes to the displaced person. So that's also something that has to be managed as well. But yeah, definitely it's something to consider.
Thanks, Di. Iris, you talked a lot about natural disasters and displaced people, but I wonder if you could be a little bit more specific about how different types of disaster might change the kind of strategies for dealing with displaced people that you adopt, or how it might influence your analysis. I'm thinking of, are there differences between hurricanes, between earthquakes, floods, fire, that sort of thing? Because clearly that will damage the fabric of the infrastructure in different ways, and therefore leave things that may or may not be used available to help deal with the aftermath.
Yeah, so that's a very good question. There definitely is a difference between the different natural disasters. For example, earthquakes, if the infrastructure of that city is in place to be able to withstand large earthquakes, probably the biggest issue would be power outages. So these are some things that you have to consider versus like a flood or a storm. It's more the impact of the water that permeates through buildings, and maybe the first floor becomes uninhabitable, but in a large city, maybe you can inhabit the larger floor buildings. So these are all probably traits of the building itself that need to be recorded within the system in order to maybe have some sort of algorithm to identify, okay, in this city an earthquake just happened, so these are the places that will probably be better suited for earthquakes, especially because earthquakes have aftershocks. So it may have withstood the first earthquake, but you don't know if it will the next one. So these are things that definitely need consideration. Yeah.
Thanks for that. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for. So if those who haven't had a chance to ask their questions, pick them up after. And thank Iris for a fantastic